Hi. This lecture I've titled it Basic Drug Types and How They Are Taken. Essentially what we're going to do in this lecture is take a brief description of some of the more common types of drugs people use to get high and talk about how they are taken. I won't really get into the various the individual drugs, but more large classifications. Well, in another lecture, I will introduce students to the individual drugs and their extent of use in U.S. society. By the way, I'm kind of sick, so please excuse me if this sounds a little scratchy on my voice. My voice is scratchy. Once again, the purpose of this lecture is to describe how drugs are taken to get high and a few of their broad classifications. I'm not going to cover every drug known in the U.S. or for the world here. I'm going to stick to some more basic ones. For example, I'm not going to cover all of the exotic club drugs that are out there or inhalants. And then there's a lot of what I call indigenous drugs. Various societies around the world have various drugs that you can take that have effects on your body. Just one example, I saw something about a tribe in the Amazon basin, and there was some sort of a toad that they got. If you touched the skin, you would have hallucinogenic effects. So I'm not going to cover stuff like that. Excuse me again. I have a cold. I apologize. The term addiction or an addictive drug will be used very precisely in this course, in this lecture. So laypersons use this term imprecisely, so that not only is every drug deemed to be addicting, but you could even say that, oh, playing a video game is addicting, shopping is addicting. But in this course, we're going to use the term addicting to mean something like this. If you use a drug regularly enough, your body will become used to having that substance. And if you stop it abruptly, you will suffer physical withdrawal symptoms that would be almost identical to another person. So you have to use the drug enough consistently, and then if you stop it, you'll get physically sick. Okay, now this is different from the idea of psychological addiction. Certain drugs are not physically addicting, for example, marijuana, but they can create psychological or psychosomatic symptoms amongst users, and these vary a whole lot. Okay, so for example, marijuana is not physically addicting in the way I just described it, but many users claim to be addicted to it. However, these physical symptoms they describe are not common amongst all users. So you take a few different marijuana users who say they're addicted to drugs, and you ask them to describe their physical symptoms, and they would vary. If a substance is truly addicting, for example, heroin, users when they stop using it, the withdrawal sickness that they describe will be very consistent and very similar. That's physical addiction. So it may be useful in this to think of real addiction as physical addiction. So when you hear the term addiction or physical addiction in this lecture, in this course, you know it refers to a very specific thing. Consistent physical withdrawal symptoms created sort of by the drug's molecular structure, if you will. Okay, there are many drugs that are not actually physically addicting, but this doesn't mean it can't be a dangerous substance to use. I like to say that many drugs that are not addictive have what's called a high potential for abuse. Cocaine is a perfect example. Cocaine is not physically addicting, but it lends itself to compulsive binging behavior. So although cocaine is not physically addicting, to suggest that it does not lend itself to dangerous compulsive use would be irresponsible. So while even extreme cocaine users are not physically addicted to the drug, many of them have very serious difficulty controlling their usage patterns. So this drug, we might say, this drug is not addictive, but we are using the word very precisely when I say that. Clearly, some drugs that are not physically addicting have a very high potential for abuse. So it's good to think that just addiction and dangerousness of a drug are not the same thing. Alcohol is actually becomes physically addicting in the way I've just described if you take large doses consistently over time, but it's clearly not as dangerous as smoking cocaine, and probably doesn't have the same potential for abuse. Most people do not binge on crack cocaine or alcohol, but it would be irresponsible to say that crack cocaine does not have a higher potential for abuse than alcohol. Although one could dispute this, and we won't get into that in this lecture. The next thing is that I'd like to just, as a side note about addiction, what I've just said about physical addiction, some brain chemists are beginning to argue that certain drugs that we wouldn't call physically addicting the way I've just described, that is, they don't create consistent physical withdrawal symptoms. They can produce physical changes in brain physiology and structure that make the brain chemically used to having the drug and are thus physically addicting. This assertion of these brain changes as being evidence of physical addiction is very highly controversial in the field. For example, one might argue that a diet high in processed junk food might cause physical brain changes, and the brain might get used to those changes, and thus it's physically addicting, although junk food may not produce systematic withdrawal sickness common to all users. So it's a little bit, at this point, the scientific jury is out on it. So I just want you to be aware that some people are saying this, but please note that this is an evolving field, and it's going to take the scientific community some time to decipher the issue, and also that in the current war on drugs, a lot of drug war hawks, people who are in favor of the war on drugs, love to promote this evidence heavily to support their political views rather than their scientific views. Last thing is that when you consider how a drug makes a person feel, it's more than just molecules. Set and setting are very important. So contrary to popular discourse, the things you see in the news, read on the newspapers, the way a drug makes a human being feel is more complex than molecules and brain chemistry. Molecular structure is important to a certain extent, and it gives us important clues as to how a drug will work on the body structures. For example, some are physically addicting and some are not. But real life and life in the lab are not the same thing. You can give the person a drug in a hospital setting and then give that person the same drug in the real world, and often it will affect them very differently. Okay, so if we want to know how a drug will make a person feel, and more importantly, how using it might affect their daily life, i.e. make them act, we must take into account set and setting. Set refers to the psychological mindset of the user when they ingest the drug. So if you're pissed off, scared, or sad when you take a drug, it's very likely that that mindset will affect the way the drug makes you feel and act. Similarly, the social setting, okay, where the drug is ingested will affect the way the drug makes you feel. Consider the following examples of setting. How would you feel if you were a drunk at work versus being at your best friend's wedding? I personally, if I were drunk at work trying to give a lecture, I would feel paranoid, scared, and it wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. Whereas if I were drunk at my best friend's wedding, I might feel very happy and carefree. Marijuana, for example, is commonly thought to create laziness. However, this is a cultural thing. In the U.S., we think it makes people lazy, but in other cultures, it's thought to help people work harder, much like caffeine. So apparently they even had a study in Jamaica where they gave marijuana to field workers, and they showed that workers who were high on marijuana were more productive, cutting sugar cane, than workers who were not higher on marijuana. Now, the key here is not whether this is a good study, but that cultural or environmental setting can influence how one feels when they take a drug. If you will, the environment or the setting tells us how to feel, if you will. One last example. Imagine if you were taking LSD or ecstasy, two drugs that are supposed to wildly distort your perceptions, make you see things, hear things, and feel things that aren't actually there, if you will. Imagine if you took this drug with a small group of trusted friends when you didn't have any responsibilities, or you took it with your very old conservative grandparents at a family function, or you went to a police convention and you were using this drug, or you were taking a final exam. Same drug, different setting. What I'm suggesting is that you would feel differently because of the setting. So we must consider molecules along with the setting. So it's more than just molecules. We must consider the molecules of a certain drug along with set and setting. We cannot examine these as if they occur separately, because they don't. If you get anything, get this. How a drug makes a person feel and act is a very complex issue, and both psychological mindset and the environmental or cultural setting, along with the physiological properties or the molecular properties of a drug, have profound effects. Okay, so it's much more than just molecules. And don't fall into simplistic soundbite thinking that our society would like to have you. I should say the media tries to promote. Okay, I'm going to describe to you 4 basic ways to ingest or take a drug into your body, get it into your system, if you will. And the way that you take or ingest a drug matters. Basically, the more direct the path of that drug to your bloodstream, the more intense the high and the following low. Now, these figures are an oversimplification, but you should get the idea. Basically, what you have is horizontal dashed line, which is when you're normal or sober, and then those little peaks and valleys, if you will, are taking the drug. Now, it doesn't have to be a single dose. It's just a very vast oversimplification, okay? But essentially, a dose can be several drinks, if you will. But once you have a certain amount of the drug, you never get as high as you did the first time, essentially. Alcohol is a little bit better, but this is sort of an oversimplification, so please don't get into dosages and whatnot. But take this as a general grain of salt. Basically, the less direct modes of ingestion, way to take a drug where it takes longer to get into your blood system, you have a more gentle high and so the drug stays in your body longer, so it takes longer to get high, it takes longer for the drug to get out of your body. In less direct modes of injection. The more direct modes of ingestion, ways to take a drug where it gets into your bloodstream very quickly, you have a higher high and a corresponding lower low, because you get that dosage, if you will, very quickly. It doesn't last as long, and you have a high doesn't last as long, and then boom, you drop down and you have a lower low. Again, don't get into particular dosages, but this general oversimplification, if you will, is somewhat instructive. The first 2 ways I'm going to tell you to take or ingest a drug is to eat or drink a drug. Basically, you swallow it into your stomach, and the drug gets into your blood just like food or drink would. Essentially, your stomach digests it, and somehow it gets into your bloodstream. But that takes a while to happen. So it's one of the less intense ways in that it takes a while for that drug to get into your bloodstream. When you sniff or snort it, basically you inhale the drug into your nasal passages, and the drug somehow gets into your bloodstream. I guess your nasal passages are very thin, and so it gets into your blood through your nasal tissues. It's a little bit more rapid than drinking it, but it's also, I call it, less intense in that you don't get as quick a dose as you do from the next 2 ways of taking a drug I'm going to introduce you to later. Okay, these next 2 ways to take a drug are what I call more intense ways. Essentially what these are very quick ways to get an amount of drugs into your bloodstream, which is what makes you high. To smoke it or inhale it, that's one very quick way. You can burn it or heat it so the drug becomes a vapor, and you inhale it into your lungs. The lungs are directly connected to the bloodstream because of the whole oxygen-carbon dioxide thing. So when you take a deep breath, we just got a drug we might call oxygen, but if you had something else when you inhaled it, it very quickly goes into your bloodstream. Obviously, just so you know, I'm not getting into every drug, but some things are vapors without them being heated, so you don't have to add heat to smoke it, such as people sniff paint, they call it. Basically, they're inhaling paint. Or you may have heard of inhaling laughing gas. I think it's called nitrous oxide. It's the stuff they give you at the dentist that makes you feel all loopy. You can inhale that. Very quick way to get it into your brain. Injecting a drug is you basically use a needle. You make it the drug becomes you have to make the drug a liquid form. You stick it in the needle and you inject it directly into your bloodstream. Most commonly, that's the way they do it. You can also inject the drug into your muscle, but it's a very inefficient way to do it. It's not widely practiced. But essentially, think of it as most people who inject a drug go directly into a vein. I think it's a vein. It's the most common way, and obviously it goes right into your blood, so it's a very direct way. But notice the very quick high. You get a lot of the drug in your system right away, and then your body metabolizes it very quickly because you have a very large dose in a very short amount of time. That's what makes the really quick high. The body then metabolizes the drug fairly quickly, and then you have a corresponding low. Notice how you have this. You never quite get as high as you do the first time. Again, this isn't exactly, don't think of those peaks as single doses, but essentially people who smoke cocaine describe this kind of thing where, and somewhat ice smokers explain it as well, but you sort of never get as high as that first dose when you smoke a drug, and you kind of never, they call it chasing something, they don't call it. Essentially, you never get as high as that first big hit or that first dose, and you sort of have this diminishing return, so you don't get as high and you get lower. And so, as we'll talk about later, what many cocaine and smokers and ice smokers, methamphetamine smokers, will describe, as much as they wanting to get high, what they're doing is they're running away from the low. Okay, so I've described 4 ways of ingesting a drug. The first one was to eat or swallow it. That's less intense. Next way is to snort it into your nasal passages. And then these 2 here are smoking it or injecting it, which are very quick ways to get the drug into your blood. Some basic classifications of drugs. I'm just going to give you 3 basic ones. Depressants, they depress the body. Think of it as if your body was an engine, such as a car. The engine's body slows down. The RPMs go down. RPM is a way, means revolutions per minute. It's a way to measure how quickly a car engine or an engine is turning, if you will. So think of it as you're letting off the accelerator and the car goes home, slows down. Okay, so alcohol, opiates such as heroin, or if you've taken opiate-based pain pills such as OxyContin or Vicodin, these are depressants. Downers, which were popular in the 1970s in Hawaii, these are barbiturates. These are all downers that slow the body's engine down. Essentially, you die from an overdose of a depressant by your heart and lungs going too slow to sustain life. Stimulants are the opposite. Think of it as the body's engine going faster. The RPMs go up. So you go from idling. So that's my chief imitation of the RPMs going up. So the body's engine is stimulated because it is a stimulant. Cocaine and amphetamine, which is a generic term for speed, methamphetamine, or ice, are all stimulants. They make the body's engine go faster. You would die by the heart-lungs system going too fast or getting a stroke. I'm no physiologist, but I like to explain it sort of like is that if you were to overdose on a stimulant, it's like blowing a car's engine. You make the engine go too fast for too long, and the engine blows up, and it can no longer function. We'll cover hallucinogens. Hallucinogens is a catch-all category, if you will, and many drugs are hard to classify. Most of all, marijuana or cannabis is the hardest to classify, and it's generally placed in this category because they don't have anywhere else to place it. But generally, hallucinogens distort your perceptions. Your perceptions of the way you see things, feel things, hear things, or perceive them, if you will. Okay, all drugs do this, but hallucinogens really distort the way you feel, see, hear things dramatically. People who take LSD or acid talk about seeing little pink elephants on the walls when there are no pink elephants on the walls. The only true hallucinogens are LSD, that's acid, or peyote, which is a Indian form. You may have heard of magic mushrooms in Hawaii. I'm sorry, forget what it's called. Anyway, magic mushrooms are hallucinogens. They mess with your your perceptions. Marijuana and club drugs like ecstasy are sometimes put in this category, but it's hard to say what they are. One thing I want you to know is that there's not a single documented marijuana overdose ever. This is not true of club drugs. You can overdose from some club drugs. Club drugs and some LSD are hard to classify or harder to say because sometimes they're cut or adulterated by drug dealers. They're mixed with other substances to increase profit. Essentially, they dilute it. So imagine I had a cup of water, literally 1 cup. If I added another cup, now I have 2 cups of water to sell. So I've now doubled the amount of drugs I have to sell. So sometimes people will cut club drugs or LSD with other things. And so, for example, if you have pure LSD, people have described it as a much different high than LSD that's been adulterated and is speedy, if you will, meaning they put some sort of amphetamine in there. So 3 classifications of drugs: stimulants make your body stimulated, the engine go faster; depressants make the body go slower; and hallucinogens, they make you see, feel things. They distort your perceptions, if you will. Okay, how you take a drug or ingest a drug matters. Okay, basically the more direct path to your brain, if you could skip down a bullet point, the more direct path the blood has into your bloodstream, the more intense the high and the following low. Those figures are an oversimplification, but you should get the idea. If you take a drug in a mode of ingestion, such as smoking it and ingesting it, those get that drug into your bloodstream very quickly, and they're going to influence the way that drug makes you feel. In terms of how you feel, your psychological mindset before you take the drug and the environmental or cultural setting also influence the way a drug makes you feel or act. Imagine being drunk at a job interview, the most important job interview of your life, as opposed to your best friend's wedding. Those you would have a different mindset, and the setting and the way you felt would be different. And then lastly, there are 3 types of drugs: stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens. Stimulants stimulate the body. They make the engine go faster. Depressants depress the body. They make the engine go slower. And hallucinogens make you hallucinate. They affect your perceptions, if you will. Okay, that's the end of this.